to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest is Adam Bryant, author of the book, The Leap to Leader. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. And is it 2 years ago or 3 years ago that I had you on my show for one of your other books?
Exactly. It's about 2 years ago.
Wow, can't believe it's been that long. And the show's been on now for 4 years, and we've done over 200 authors. So I'm thrilled to have you today.
Yeah.
And congratulations on another great book.
Thank you.
Let's start off with telling the audience about your professional background. So if you could get us up to speed about how you got to where you're at right now.
Sure. So I was a journalist for most of my career, 18 years at the New York Times as a reporter and editor, and I spent 6 years at Newsweek magazine. But I got into the leadership space in 2009 when I created a weekly interview series with CEOs in the Sunday business section called the Corner Office. And it was based on a what if, which is, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies, which is how most reporters interview CEOs, right? But I was curious about them as human beings and how they navigate the universal challenges of leadership, hiring, creating cultures, just all the, again, universal challenges of leadership. So I did that for a decade, interviewed more than 500 CEOs, started writing books, teaching leadership on the side. I left the Times 7 years ago to join my current firm. We're the Exco Group. We do executive coaching and leadership development, mostly at the C-suite level. And I've continued my approach of interviewing leaders about leadership on LinkedIn, where I've got a few interview series with pretty big followings. But that's been my kind of approach, essentially taking a journalistic approach to understanding leadership. Looking for meaningful insights, memorable stories, actionable frameworks, just from all the people that I've been lucky to meet. And I write books and articles. It's essentially pattern recognition, like what's the broader analysis? What are the themes that emerge from all these conversations? So that's been my approach.
What a great job to have. That's the best job, is to interview these guys. I'm also a journalist by training, and worked for newspapers since I was 15, but I was going to be a career sports writer, and I loved interviewing all these athletes. But like you, all my books have been on business and have been interviewing CEOs for like 30 years. Is there one, two, maybe three leaders that you've interviewed that you go, these guys are, men or women, are amazing?
I have to say, I mean, it's kind of asking me to choose among my children.
Yeah, I know.
I was very fortunate. I was also in the good position shortly after I started Corner Office at the New York Times. I was getting pitched all day long by companies and PR people, please interview our CEO. So I was in the position of kind of being a bouncer at a club, and I could decide who I interviewed, and I asked for a lot of information up front. And I was really looking for people who were thoughtful about leadership. And the kind of terms of engagement for interviewing is like, you need to be candid, open, and honest with me about your kind of leadership struggles over the years, or we're not going to have this conversation. And because of that, just people who are, I found in general, very eager to have the conversation. Because if you're a CEO, you spend your day basically answering questions about the strategy and the results, right? Few people ask you about, like, well, what were early influences that shaped who you are as a leader?
Right.
So I generally found people were very eager to have those conversations, and very willing to be vulnerable, to share their stories, to talk about how dysfunctional family life when they were a kid really influenced them. And so I'm not going to say this about every conversation, but I have to say the vast majority of them were just very meaningful and memorable.
Because I've been reading, I read Walter Isaacson's book. I've read I think all of his books, actually, about Steve Jobs, and I'm reading the one on Elon Musk. And I think it's very hard to teach students that about how to be a good person and lead. Then when you read about these folks, Bill Gates, that they're temperamental, that they're hard on people, that they're unforgiving, that they push people to work at, incredible amount of hours, no matter how brilliant you are, and yet you're trying to teach them how to be supposedly good leaders, but the ones who have come out on top, at least what they see, either through size of company, personal wealth, whatever, doesn't speak well for, how leaders should lead. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I always tell people I do a lot of talks with business school students, and your point is a good one. It often comes up, and the people that you mentioned, those sort of like truly famous CEOs, they are somewhat outliers, and I put them in the category of like true visionaries. I mean, they've just got like this, like they see the future, and everybody's got to get in line behind them, or there's just no time, right? And so as a result of that, they tend to have very tough leadership styles. And so I tell people those are outliers, and we all know like of their incredible success, but unless you are one of those, that's not how you should be, right? Because especially in the last few years, I feel like people's tolerance for bad bosses is going down. There's just been so many changes, with the pandemic, and people have done a lot of internal reflection about what's meaningful for them in life. And I just think the tolerance for a bad user experience of a boss is dropping. And if you want to attract talent and hold on to talent, I think there's only one way to do it, which is to be a really effective leader.
I also think I'm 63. I think what's also changed is, and I tell my students this, when I was their age, you drove to wherever you worked. You worked within a half an hour, 45 minutes. So there was only a limited number of companies you could possibly work for. And then when it was in the 90s, people started to, the internet started to come into play, and you had more options. And now people can be working in Hanoi, Vietnam for a company in Philadelphia, and vice versa. And if you got a bad boss, well, or a bad leader, CEO, you just said, you know what, I'm not worried about having limited choices. I got the whole world to choose from. Screw them. I'm leaving.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I'm at my core an optimist, and I'd like to think that over time people will become better bosses, and because of the forces we're talking about. But that said, I still think there are too many bad bosses and too many bad leaders in the world. And I would say if you gave me a magic wand with infinite power and three wishes, I would say, get rid of racism, inequality, and bad bosses. And I put bad bosses in there because I think we sometimes underappreciate the negative impact that they have, not only on their organizations, on their teams, but also individuals. I mean, I've worked for bad bosses. Pretty much everybody on this call has, no doubt. And you know what it's like. It's a toxic experience, the stress that it creates, and very often long-term stress. So again, part of the reason I do the work and write the books that I do is that somehow make a small contribution to helping people become better managers and leaders, then that's a good day.
When you're talking to an audience or talking to young people, especially they're impressionable while they're still undergraduates, what do you define as a good leader? What's your view of what the criteria, and what does a good leader look like?
Well, are you good for the next 5 hours? No, but I would say, look, I think there's a few core skills that leader has to have. And I think the first one is to be able to simplify complexity, right? That is just the world is getting more complex. And I just don't think you can be an effective leader or manager if you are unable to sort of take the funnel in effect, and like there's all this information, everything going on in the world, in your industry, et cetera, and then be able to boil that down to the bottom of the funnel and say to your team, say to your company, look, this is where we're going. This is like the big idea, the big goal we're going after. These are the 3 or 4 things we're going to do to get there. these are the 3 or 4 challenges we need to overcome, and let's be honest with ourselves and realistic about that. And this is how we're gonna keep score. And to me, like, that is a fundamental skill that every leader has to have. And I also, Mark, the one way I like to think about leadership is sort of 2 categories. There's one is what leaders do, and the other is how you need to be as a leader, like who you are as a human being. And I think simplifying complexity and coming up with clear strategy is maybe at the top of the list of what you have to do as a leader. But if people are going to follow you, they have to trust you. They have to see you as authentic. Somebody who's going to be predictable in the best sense of the word, that you're not going to be like one of those bosses who's incredibly moody and changes their mind and depending on the day is going to react one way or another. And so again, to get that followership, to get that discretionary effort from your team, you have to be like clear about who you are, and you also have to be selfless. I know people often use this idea of like servant leadership. You know, you hear that a lot. I hear that a lot. Um, and and I get it, but we need to acknowledge it is a 50-year-old phrase. And I think it lacks precision, because at the end of the day, as Bob Dylan reminds us, everybody's got to serve somebody. So saying you're a servant leader, what does that mean? And I think a more precise way to think about the different kinds of leaders is that some of them are more selfless, that they see their team as like, I'm here to help you and help you achieve your goal and help the organization. It's not about them. Whereas we've all met other leaders who are more self-centered, right? They see their teams like, what are you going to do for me and help me in my career? And so I think to be an effective leader, you've got to simplify complexity, and you've also got to be, as a person, clear about like who your values are, predictable, so that that builds trustworthiness, and be more selfless with your teams, and that it's not about you, it's about them and the organization.
Am I saying his name right? The leader of Microsoft, Nadella?
Satya, yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of the prime example of what you're talking about from everything I've read. I mean, going from Steve Ballmer, where it was like a loss of a decade for Microsoft, to where this guy is and what people say he's done for Microsoft internally. And I know from teaching at Wharton, when before he arrived, none of my students, MBA students, wanted to work there. The ones who worked there for a summer said it was a horrible experience. Now I hear people say, oh my God, it's an amazing experience again working at Microsoft.
Yeah, and he really is, I mean, sort of shining example of the power of transformational leadership, right? Because we all know the problems at Microsoft that he inherited, right? They were behind on cloud computing, a lot of technology. They'd made some bad bets. But more importantly, the culture of Microsoft was incredibly siloed, right? People didn't necessarily work together. And there was a little bit of like, we used to be the market leader. That's not how we do things. And you know, a lot of people say it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to change a culture. But Satya has he's got this masterful ability, it's kind of broad brush leadership, right? Where he introduced this idea of like, you know, shifting from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture, and really hammering on this idea of growth mindset. And again, like just the nuance of how he frames things, you know, acknowledging and respecting the past of what Microsoft had accomplished, while also pointing to a new future, a new culture. Again, he's put on a masterclass there, and it shows in, you know, financial performance and just kind of the buzz and momentum that the company has.
So now let's talk about this latest book you've written. Why did you write this book?
Sure. So the book I wrote before it was called The CEO Test, and it was really focused on the 7 key tests of all leaders, not just CEOs. And I put that in the category of what I mentioned earlier, like, what do leaders do? And then what can we learn from CEOs about how to do them well? But really focus on this is the core work of any leader. And again, what can we learn from CEOs? And I felt like that there was a missing part of it, which is the second B, which is, what does it mean to be a leader? And, you know, underscore that word be and put it in boldface and italics. What is the mindset shift that you need to make to be a leader? So I see them as kind of like a, two halves of a whole, which is CEO test is about what you need to do as a leader. Leap to leader is more about the internal work that you need to do to become a leader. Again, in mindset, if not title.
So in chapter one, what lesson, and you can explain who this is, Penny Hercher, I hope I pronounced that name
Yeah.
correctly, learned from a board member that helped her understand the essence of leadership. And how did it change her approach as CEO?
Yeah, and she is one of a few executives. The way I want to start off the book is really show, not just tell, but show how there are these moments, and like capitalize the M in that word. There are these moments when you realize it's like, okay, wow, like I am a leader now. This is what it means to be a leader. And for this one executive, Penny Hersher, she told me this great story about how when she first became a CEO, she was like shifting the strategy and she was checking in with the board about her plans. And at one point, a director said to her, Penny, you can like share your ideas with me all you want, and we can back you, but it doesn't change the fact that if you're wrong, we're going to fire you. And for her, it was this light bulb moment. It's like, wow, the buck really does stop with me. Again, having a director say, it doesn't matter whether we agree with you or not. If you are wrong, we are going to fire you. And so, again, like to be the true leader, to be the CEO, to be in charge means accepting that responsibility. That was a tough message, and it was a very blunt message from her director. But to me, I used it as a really good example of like, the buck really does stop with you when you move into these roles, and you have to be up for that.
How does Phil Martin's metaphor of stoplight moments during the 2008 financial crisis
Yeah.
illustrate the unique challenges and responsibilities faced by leaders in times of crisis, which
Yeah,
that was a huge crisis period?
exactly. And again, another leadership moment, right? And I love Phil's story that he told. He was CEO of a company 2008. I think they were planning to go public. And then he gets a call from his CFO about, the markets melting down, the start of the financial crisis. And Phil just sort of pulled over to the side of the road and was like sort of processing this. And it gave him this shorthand, because when he's mentoring other leaders, he talks about these stoplight moments where you're like maybe driving home at the end of a long day and you're just absorbing and trying to process the enormity of the challenge or a tough question you're dealing with. And you're sitting at a stoplight, a red stoplight turns green, and you're just sitting there because you're like so lost in thought. And you get somebody honking you from behind and it sort of wakes you up. But just like it, to me, it's a wonderful metaphor for the reality that when you are a leader, you are going to have those stoplight moments where you're just like, this is a massive problem. I don't know what to do. And again, when you sign up to be a leader, you should be fully aware of what you're getting into. And that's a big part of the book. Is what I tell people is like, you may be very clear about why you want to be a leader and what your internal motivations are. And is it for money? Do you want a new title so that you can brag about it if your company's return to office? Do you want a bigger office? Just be very clear and do as much research as possible so that when you do step into a leadership role, you're not that surprised. There's always going to be some realities of the job that you didn't expect, but you need to minimize that gap as much as you can. And so that's why I really wanted in the first chapter, the sort of idea is like, be clear about what you're signing up for. There's going to be stoplight moments where you're just going, wow, like I had not expected this. This is what the job is.
I think every CEO you ever talk to says that a half of every plan they write is wrong. They just don't know which half is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And another great shorthand is like strategy documents should be written in pencil, right? Because like, as soon as you come up with a strategy, then the world is changing so fast. It's a much more fluid process. And when I think about all the challenges of being a leader, I find it's very helpful to think of leadership in terms of paradoxes or contradictions or balancing acts, right? As much as there's this temptation in the leadership field to sort of say leadership is about this one thing, Mark, it's like that's not
Yeah.
how it works, right? And if we were to do the whiteboard exercise of like, well, what are the biggest challenges of leadership? The one that I'd probably push to the top is this balancing act of, on the one hand, having the courage to make a decision, right? Because let's face it, Mark, you work with senior leaders through, like, as we all know, some people struggle with just making a decision, right?
Yeah.
Because it'd be nice if there was some universe where you had 100% of the data you wanted and needed to make a decision, but that's not how the world works, right? The problems that come to you, you have to bring a lot of judgment, some guesswork. I often think about this idea that, we use this word strategy, but businesses are in the business of making bets. That's what strategies are, right? They're educated guesses. They're guesses built on analysis, but at the end of the day, they are bets. So again, take this idea. On the one hand, you have to have the courage and the confidence to make a bet as a leader. And at the same time, this is where the difficult part comes in. Have the courage to make the decision, make the bet, but at the same time, always be questioning your own assumptions that underlie those decisions, right? And that is a very difficult balancing act. We know some leaders who are overly confident, they have no trouble making decisions, but they don't do enough questioning of their own assumptions. And at the other extreme, you have people who question their assumptions so much that it's paralyzing and they're unable to make decisions. So to me, like, that's a big part of the challenge of leadership and what people need to be aware of, again, before they sign up for these big jobs.
One of the things I share with my students is that all they read about is the success stories, but I give them the failures of the superstars. So showing them that these guys, men and women, no matter how great they appear, they also have many failures, and sometimes as many failures as they've had successes. And here's what they've learned from them. So just because you failed doesn't mean that you're a failure. That you're going to take risk, and this is going to happen.
Yeah. And look, sports is often overused as a metaphor for
I
business.
love sports. Is that metaphor?
Right. Sometimes overused, full stop. However, to quote the current CEO of Nike, when I interviewed him years and years ago, John Donahoe, he said you have to have the mentality of like a baseball player. And if you have a batting average of like 300, like you're
You're right.
doing,
You're a Hall of Famer.
yeah,
Yeah, and look at venture capitalists, right? They look at 1,000 to 2,000 deals a year, invest in 10, and only one's a home run. So they're really one out of 1,000 or 2,000.
exactly. Exactly.
And they hire the smartest people, they do the most research, they have the most, uh, the broadest amount of connections, everything. And still, it doesn't work out for them. Uh, and all you're hearing about is the success stories.
Right. And what you just said, I think, underscores this notion that again, business relies on sort of confidence and certainty, right? Like those are core currencies of business. Yet we also need to acknowledge that a lot of business is just making bets. If you're a venture capital firm, you're just making bets. You don't know, as you said, you look at 1,000 deals, you place 10 bets, you don't know which one is going to pay off.
You have no idea. And there's going to be periods of time that you go through where everything goes wrong that's totally out of your control. And you can't explain why that happened or explain why you've had this run of success.
Right.
In your book, you write about, in this one chapter, what key aspect of leadership does Mary Elizabeth Poirier's transition from a fixer to a higher leadership role highlight, and why is it crucial for new leaders to delegate and prioritize?
Yeah. And again, another great story from an executive. This is why I take this approach of interviewing leaders about their leadership lessons and, their insights and the stories behind them. And she shared with me the story is how she was like kept moving up. And somebody gave her the advice that the things that you love doing the most and are particularly good at and want to continue doing, you have to give those things away to others so that you can scale yourself as a leader. And that is hard for people to do because look, we all have those things that, we kind of see as our superpowers, right? We're really good at them. We're fast at them. It's very rewarding. We get lots of good feedback as we're moving up about, man, you are really good at this. So you move up in these bigger leadership positions and that's your comfort zone, right? Like you want to keep doing that, whether it's public speaking or whatever it is. And so you have to be able to say to yourself, as much as I like doing that, I'm good at it, I find it rewarding. If I want to keep moving up, I have to take these things that I like doing and give them away, give them to my team so that they can learn how to do them, so that they can shine, so that I can focus on higher order things in my leadership position. And again, to me, it was such a powerful story and such a powerful insight because this is a universal challenge of people when they move up into bigger and bigger leadership roles. They tend to always gravitate back to the things that they are really good at. And you have to give those things away. Not all of them, right? As another data point, I spoke to David Wilkie, who's the chairman of World 50, and he shared with me this great insight in where he talked about how micromanagement is always seen as like a bad thing, right? And I say all this in the context of like everything is a balancing act. So on the one hand, great advice from Mary Elizabeth Poré about how you have to give away the things that you like doing best. The David Wilkie point is also true, which is that you do have to micromanage certain parts of the business. And if you're a leader, you have to figure out what are the 20%, what is the 20% of the business that you really need to focus on to make sure that the company gets that right because it's going to have this outsized impact. And so it's not like you don't micromanage at all. It's like you have to figure out what you need to pay really close attention to because you're going to get the greatest leverage out of that. So again, leadership is a balancing act. Both things can be true. And frankly, this is why leadership is so hard.
Going along those lines, how can young managers best balance taking risks with making sound decisions, especially when faced with unfamiliar opportunity like an overseas assignment?
Yeah, and again, another balancing act, right? Like, whether it's a career choice about, or there's this big new job way outside your comfort zone, and when there is that unknown, some people run away from it, right? Like, I don't know. I that makes me uncomfortable. I'm not sure that wasn't what my plan was for my own career. And the advice is to really just sort of pause and really check that. And realize that growth comes from putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. So the first one is this idea of like lean into that discomfort because as we all know from our lives, like this is where this is how you grow, right? So that's the first point. And the second point is I always tell people as they're coming up through their careers, like not to have an overly rigid plan for themselves. And because I find when I talk to recent college grads, they often have very specific career plans for the next decade. By this age, I want to
Yeah.
this title and be making this much money. And I always tell them that's not how life works. When you get, you and me have a 6 in front of our ages, you get to our age and you realize that's not how careers work. Careers work largely based on, you do good work, you connect with a boss, you got good chemistry, always delivering for them. The boss gets a new job and they want to bring you with them. right? And so they go off and do something, or maybe they leave the company and then you go over there. That's the way careers evolve. And so you need to be just, I think people need to just in general be more open to opportunities that they didn't plan for them and see them as an opportunity to learn new skills and have new experiences.
You mentioned a belief that being a good manager is crucial for adding shareholder value. How have you seen this philosophy play out in real world organizational dynamics?
Well, I think everybody on this call and who's listening to this, if you spend any time in the working world and have a manager, like, first of all, you understand how much the effectiveness, the quality of your manager affects your life and your work, right? And I sometimes have found in society just the term manager, like managers are kind of punchlines in popular culture, right? And TV shows and cartoons and sort of like management, and people prefer to talk about like leadership, but managers are have such an impact on how effective people are in their jobs, and how they have this sort of outsized impact on whether the team is performing well or not performing. Just for myself, like I never wanted to become a manager. I really enjoyed being a reporter in all my years at the New York Times and Newsweek, but I became a manager because I just couldn't tolerate working for another bad manager. Right. And so, I think we've all had an appreciation of the impact that a manager can have on our lives. So that has always been true. But I think in the last few years with the pandemic, just so much has changed about work and life and society and the way corporations run, that managers are taking on a growing burden of their relationship with their employees beyond just the work they're doing. The nature of work is changing. Um, Employees are expecting much more from their leaders. So the burden and responsibility on managers, I think, is only going up. And people need to be aware of that before they become managers. It's not just this idea of like, okay, I'm in boss of the team and I'll tell them what to do. The role has become more complex. There's more responsibility. But if companies do it well, if they train their managers, give them the support, I think more people are recognizing the impact that good managers will have on, again, elevating individuals, elevating teams, and in the process, elevating the organization overall.
GE used to be known as a factory of CEOs and leaders, and they had until recently a campus that was like its own university. Uh, what happened there that they ceased turning out leaders that were in high demand? And what companies have you looked at and interviewed, maybe even worked with, that are really good at developing leaders today?
Yeah, I think some broader context is helpful to answer your question, Mark. Because I think the sort of famous GE school of management, like that evolved during a very different time. And I could make some generalizations, but I think they hold up, that there was a period before the pandemic lasting, several decades where the world was relatively stable, right? There was, some disruption, but overall, the world and the world of business was a pretty stable place. And in that stability, you had things like Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, where
Yeah.
he identified the best companies because those companies and the leaders identified a strategy and stuck with it over time, right? So that was a really great research project and valid for its time. In that era of relative stability, companies could focus much more on optimizing efficiency, right? That was when we saw the era of like Six Sigma evolve. And so it was all this like optimize, make things more efficient, bring almost a scientific, mathematical approach to how to do something, and leadership became part of that. And so that's why it's like, can we create a leadership factory, right? If we all do it this way, that is applicable to other companies. And that was true for that period up to a point, right? But that was then, and this is now. And now, like, leadership is just infinitely more complex. Maybe not infinitely, but 5 times harder, 10 times harder. Pick a number. Cycle times are shorter. This idea that it's like we can create a strategy roadmap for the next 5 years. That's not how the world works. We can't see beyond 6 months, right? So the demands of leadership are so much more different now, that this idea that we can take a highly scientific, methodological approach to creating leaders and pursuing leadership, that was for a very different time. It's not now. And in the work that we do with our client companies, from Fortune 50 to, medium and smaller size companies, everybody frankly is trying to figure this out, right? Nobody has cracked the code, because this is still an emerging problem set they are wrestling with, which is like, given the turmoil, the constant disruption in the world, what is our framework? What is our approach to developing leaders? And a lot of that goes back to this idea, like, are you comfortable in this moment where plans change all the time, right? Like, you've got to be comfortable in that environment. And in the same way I was talking earlier about like how you need to be as a leader, people expect so much more from their leaders. Like this words like humanity, authenticity, humility, transparency. We are expecting so much more from our leaders rather than just growing the company. Like, that's another demand that is factoring into how people both identify leaders and also develop them.
Sheila Talton emphasizes pushing stars out and advocating for their advancement. How can managers balance nurturing talent within their teams while also ensuring their own team's success and development?
Sure. And for this, I mean, look, I as I get older, I like sentences that begin with "there's only 2 kinds of ...
Huh.
And I have found in my experience that there's only 2 kinds of managers. There are some those who, when they get talent, they tend to want to hold on to them, right? It's sort of like hoarding my talent, and, because they help me shine and they make my job easier. And there are others who, like Sheila Talton, who I quote in the book, who are always like trying to push out their stars and help them like get big jobs elsewhere. And the reason that she took that approach, to me, makes a lot of sense. And for this reason, that I always see teams and departments in any organization, you're always going to have momentum one way or the other in terms of attracting talent or talent leaving you, right? And so if you can create this reputation for yourself as a leader of a team where you attract talent, you help grow them, and people go on to great, bigger and better jobs because of having worked for you, that's going to create just more and more momentum, this magnetic pull, where you're going to be seen as like this amazing coach and somebody who creates springboards for talent to get them into other big new jobs. And so again, as a manager, as a leader, it's one of those introspective moments. You have to decide what kind of man. Are you going to be a talent hoarder, where if you get somebody, you'll like really hold on to them and almost bar them from like moving on to bigger jobs? Or do you want to be that sort of amazing talent coach that like people go on to bigger and better things?
Isn't that what attracts more talent? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah, you
I
get
mean,
that magnet, that flywheel effect for sure.
yeah, I mean, people don't want to work for it because they feel that you're going to teach them things. I think even in sports, right, one of the most interesting things I've seen, and I looked into this, was that all of the assistant coaches that Bill Belichick had in his 24 years at New England, who all became head coaches, only one of them ever had a winning record. Uh, and none of them won a Super Bowl. Where Andy Reid has had, I think, 4 of his assistants win Super Bowls, and many of his assistants who became head coaches had winning records. And I just wonder, what does he teach as a leadership style that
Yeah.
seems to produce so many winners? And they're all from the Bill Welch tree, all of them. I mean, Bill Welch's tree is like a full garden.
Yeah. And to me, that notion of the coaching tree from sports, like how, people who
Right.
were under you, what have they gone on to do?
Yeah.
Again, another transferable metaphor, because if you're ambitious and want to move up in a big company, people are looking at you. One of the criteria that they are using to assess you is, do you build other leaders, right? Have you created a coaching tree? And to me, so it's like you have to have that impulse for being like, I'm going to attract talent and help them springboard and coach them to go on and do great things rather than to hoard the talent.
Um, how can new managers develop their emotional intelligence to navigate these complexities effectively? And emotional intelligence now is a lot more important than when you and I graduated college.
Yeah. Yeah. And emotional intelligence, again, it's being clear about what you are getting into. Like if you've never been a manager, about to move into a manager role, um, it's, you just have to understand that you are going to have people problems. People are very complex on their own day to day. And I think the levels of complexity grow in the workplace because you have interpersonal dynamics, and people also bring a lot of their, their hopes and dreams and career aspirations, their relationship with authority figures that might have to do with how they related to their parents, all that stuff. It's like they're pulling a little red wagon into work, with a lot of emotional stuff. And you need to be aware of that and prepared for it, and to not be surprised when it happens. But if you're going to be effective manager, you have to, again, strike this balance, right? Because you want to be empathetic, you want to be understanding, you want to get to know your employees, right? You have to show an interest in them personally beyond just the scope of work and their job, right? So that is true. And if you're going to get that discretionary, inspirational effort from people, they have to feel like you care about them as a boss. Here's another balancing act. So while that is true, you also have to be clear about sort of where the lines are. And at some point, it has to be about the work and it has to be about performance. So yes, I care about you personally, but you are in a particular role, and what I need from that role is the following work. And so you need to decide, like, are you the right person for that? So again, this is something that I find it can take a while for new managers and leaders to find that balance point. It's almost like you need to think of it as a pendulum, because sometimes when people move into manager roles, they go too far one way or another. So some people say it's like, I'm the boss, I'm going to act bossy, right? We're just going to talk about the work. I'm not really interested in you as a person. It's just about performance. So at the other extreme, some people go like, we're still friends, right? And like, I want to be, your friend, and I want to be liked, and I want to care about you, and I want to help fix your personal problems. And that's too far. And I've had CEOs who told me it took them 10 years, literally 10 years of managing and leading people before they hit that balance point where it's like, I'm being friendly, but I'm not, I'm not your friend. And I am your boss, but I'm not going to act bossy, right? Like those are balancing acts.
All the CEOs I've interviewed, they all tell me the one same thing. I said, what's the biggest mistake you've ever made? And they all said to me, not firing fast. I, and I always said to them, I don't think that's a big mistake because it shows people that you have tolerance for mistakes, that people can make them and they won't be fired for just mistakes. But almost all of them said the same thing to me. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is human nature, right? Because if you're like a CEO, for example, or even like leader of any team, you hire somebody and you are essentially saying like, I'm betting on you, right? You are a reflection of my judgment, and I want to think that I'm a good judge of character, right? And so somebody gets into a role and then problems start emerging. It's hard to, it's almost like investing in a stock and staying with it, right? People don't want to acknowledge that they made a mistake. It's very disruptive to fire people. It's disruptive to you, particularly them. It's disruptive to the team. It also means you have to go out and hire somebody else who you don't know if they're going to have their own problems, right? The other thing that's a very familiar pattern in our work with senior leaders is they might have somebody on their team who was the right person for the last 3 years, right? And they're, good person, they're good glue for the team. They were the right person for that role for the last 3 years. But if we want to get this company to the next level, they are not the right person for this next. And that can be very hard to do, right? Because you spend a lot of time with these people. In tough times, in the foxhole, you have fun times together,
Right.
these
Especially
personal relationships.
startups.
Yeah, but like to be able to say, you are not, your contribution has been so powerful for the last 3 years, but you are not the right person to help us get to the next level. That's hard for people to do. And this idea of like, fire fast. I just like you, I have heard that from so many CEOs over the years. Um, and there's a shorthand of like, I've never regretted firing somebody too soon, which there's kind of a logic flaw in that, because if you fired them, then you can't see what might have happened if they stuck around.
Yeah.
But you set aside the logic flaw, and I will add an asterisk, right? Which is that I have also heard from many leaders, and I have seen it myself in my career, this phenomenon, there's a good shorthand for it, Mark. It's called right plant, wrong pot.
Hmm.
And this idea that it's like sometimes people are just in the wrong jobs. And they may be struggling in a particular role here, but you put them over there and it's like suddenly they're flourishing, right? And so there are enough of those cases where you can't just sort of always take like this, oversimplified rule of like, I'm just going to fire everybody quickly. It doesn't roll, because there's always going to be those things where it's like you move somebody a different job and it's like, wow, like I did not know that, but they're killing it in this new role. So again, I'm always wary. I'm always skeptical of people who take this like blanket approach to some facet of leadership, because leadership is about nuance and gray areas. And there's no like one size fits all cookie cutter approach that's going to work.
Like everything else in life, and as you get older, you realize there's so many shades of gray that you, even as you get older, you don't have certitudes and definite definitions for anything. Question from the audience. In your opinion, what are the most important lessons leaders of small businesses can learn from leaders who lead massive companies successfully? Do you think leadership style must change depending on the size of the organization and the type of employees an organization needs to have to operate professional, semi-skilled workers, etc.?
So I tend to focus on finding what are the through lines, right? What are the universal challenges of leadership? So what's same, what's different in different size companies, et cetera. So let me focus on what the core of your question that I heard is like, what can leaders of like startup, smaller companies learn from the lessons of people who've run big companies?
Right.
And to me, the biggest one leaps to mind is this notion of like clarity around your prioritization, and not allowing yourself to get caught up in sort of the day-to-day fire drills, right? Because this is true of any and every job. You're always going to have those fire drills. Some new problem with a client or shipping or the system that you've just built isn't working. And it is very easy to just spend every minute of every day like just putting out fires, right? You've got people fires, you're hiring, you're firing, like just all those things. And the discipline that you need, and whether it's every morning or you set aside some time every Friday or over the weekend or something, is to spend some time thinking about how you are spending your time. And you may say to yourself, I don't have time to spend time to think about how I'm spending the time. But it is such an important discipline because yes, there's always going to be those aspects of work that you have to react to. That's just this part of the deal. But you have to have a plan. And to me, the key thing is like this question of when you ask yourself, okay, what do I need to accomplish? The three things. What are the three big things? It can't be 12, it can't be 24. But what are the three big things that are really going to make a difference at this company that I need to accomplish over the next 12 months? So that 12 months from now, whether it's with my team or me to myself, where it's just like, okay, that's a high five moment. We did the three big things we set out to do. And then what you do is like, as you're going through day to day, at the end of every week, you say, okay, I have articulated the three big things I need to do. How am I spending my time driving those things? Did I spend enough time on the right things? There's always going to be fires to put out, but always keeping an eye on those priorities and making sure that you are playing offense, not just defense. To me, that's the key.
So how has AI affected leadership and how should how should leaders leverage AI in a meaningful, positive way? Because I think everybody's very nervous about AI.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to pretend to be an AI expert, but from a leadership point of view, a couple of thoughts. First of all, like we are on this kind of like roller coaster hype machine about AI right now. I feel like there's periods where all the headlines and stories in the media are about how it's going to change everything forever, like nothing else that came before, right? And then there was a period, just I think it was about 6 weeks ago. Within the period of a week, both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal had pieces sort of like, puncturing the balloon, if you will, the hype balloon, saying like this stuff is pretty wonky, it's not that good, it's expensive, it's not really adding any value. And both things can be true, right? Like there's always problems short term, long term. What I would say, to me, the key point for leaders is to not outsource to others on your team or through consultants or others. Like you need to become a student yourself. And it's not one of those things you need like a white paper from somebody on your team about. Like it it could be such a big factor in your company, in your industry, that you need to jump in the pool, right? And spend some time in it and read what you can and become smart about it yourself. You may not be the expert, but you need to become a student. So to me, that's the key takeaway, rather than sort of like being paralyzed by about it. It's like, no, it's okay. Like Joe or Jane on my staff have got that. You've got to like, hit the books and read as much as you can and learn as much as you can about it, because it does have the power to be transformational, even if it's not clear how at this point.
I think from an efficiency standpoint, and I've been learning more and using it more and more, it's an amazing tool. But one of the things that we're struggling with at the university level is how much do we let students use the tool? Because when I talk to my students, I say to them, look, if you can't critically think and you're relying on AI to do the thinking for you, then why does a company need you? They'll just use more AI.
Right.
So you've got to show that you can critically think on your own and that you can use AI to get facts to develop your opinions, but you can't go and just feed the question into AI and take that as the answer.
Yeah, and the way I talk about that too is I think in this era we are living in now, from a leadership point of view, a, the right question is worth 10x the right answer, because answers are going to change with circumstances. But if you ask the right question, that that can kind of like set a direction, an area of focus, an area of productive concern for you and for the company, right? So, and that's something that you can call me naive, right? But I think where AI is like great at pattern recognition and sifting and collating and the answers that are already out there and summarizing them in a really efficient way, where I think it starts tapping out a bit is more on the virgin snow stuff of like, well, what is the question? What is the good question here? What is the unknown? What do we need to focus on that we don't have the answer for? To me, like that is where leadership comes in.
We're almost running out of time. So let me see if I can get two more questions in, and we could have spent a couple hours with you easily on your book. Can you elaborate on specific practices leaders can adopt to develop their own self-awareness?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, Mark, because people talk a lot about having a growth mindset and being open, Carol Dweck book and full respect. Like that has been such an important contribution. People can't take that and just think, well, I need to be open to new ideas. To me, the X factor, and I've talked about this with a lot of HR leaders and other CEOs. If you think about the thing that separates people, something that I think we need to talk about more is processing the experiences that you've had. Because one of the things that some people go through life having experiences. The question mark is, well, how much are they learning from their experiences? And the way you learn from your experiences is setting aside time to process what you've been through, to ask yourself questions. I just led that meeting. It didn't seem to go as well. Is there something going on with the team? Is there something that I did or did not do, or that I did differently from the last meeting that did go well? And just spending that time processing your experiences and almost seeing it as like the metaphor I use is like experience is like a wet towel, right? Like towel just soaks up all the experiences. But then what do you do? And we've all had that experience of like wringing a towel to get all the drops of water out of it. And that's what you need to do. That's what everybody needs to do with their own experience, because there's lessons in there. And your core question is like, how do you become more self-aware? And I think it starts with like questioning yourself, questioning your experiences. What did I learn from that? And again, it's pattern recognition. It's like, okay, I just led this meeting, in a new way compared to and it seemed to turn out better. So so let me try that again. So to me, that's a big key of it.
Well, we've run out of time. I so enjoyed talking to you about your book and
Thank you.
about leadership. And as I said, I think we could have spent hours getting your perspectives on all the people that you've interviewed and you're currently working with and how things have changed over time. Let me just sneak this one last question in because it occurred to me. How has leadership changed since you got involved in interviewing leaders to where we are today in 2024?
Yeah, to me, it's the two things I mentioned earlier, like just the cycle times of the world are so fast. This idea of like 5-year strategy, that would just prompt chuckles now. It didn't back then, right? Because we can't see beyond 6 months or whatever the time horizon is. So being comfortable in that, the shorthand that we use is like you need a compass, not a map to lead now. And the second one is just as a greater focus on who you are as a person, as a leader, your values. Leaders are at the sort of top of the trust index in society. People expect more from their leaders, their values. They're almost seen like politicians. So company leaders are now being held to a higher standard, for better or worse.
Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And we look forward to even the next book and having you back again.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Always enjoy our conversation.